China is ready to host the 2016 G20 Summit as world leaders start arriving in Hangzhou. Hello, I'm Nathan King in for Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. They've been called the Four Eyes towards an innovative, invigorated, interconnected and inclusive world economy. That's the motto of the 2016 G20 Summit in Hangzhou. This marks the first time China has hosted the annual summit. For what to expect in the coming days, we have CCTV Su Yuting joining us from the G20 Summit in Hangzhou. Thanks so much for joining us. This is obviously the first time China is hosting the G20. What are the major topics on the agenda?
Yes, Nathan, as you said, that this is the first time China hosts the G20 Summit. And you know that the theme of the 2016 G20 Summit is the innovative, invigorated, interconnected and inclusive world economy. And in the following days, the G20 members, together with China, will be actively engaged in the discussions such as how to maintain the sustainable, strong and balanced growth of the world economy. And you know that the turmoil in the international financial markets in 2015 just indicates that there are lots of problems need to be solved, and especially you know that the traditional structural the policies is not a very good term for the long-term resolve of the financial crisis and also to boost the world economy. So many more innovative policies such as the fiscal policy, monetary policy and also the structural policy individually and collectively are needed urgently to improve the growth model and to improve the world economy. So in the following days, another highlight is that China, together with other G20 members, will also discuss the UN Sustainable Development Agenda. And that agenda will just to ensure the consensus among lots of G20 member countries to make the elimination of the extreme poverty and also to combat climate change and working together towards the low carbon economy and the growth model. So that will be a very important meeting that all the nations are very closely following. Nathan.
Su Yuting, inclusive is one of the words, and as the world's largest developing economy, China, of course, is playing an important role in the growth of emerging markets and also contributing to the 21st century idea of a new way of global economic governance, correct?
Yes, Nathan, as you said, China will play an active role in boosting the world economy and to enhance the global economic governance system. And you know that as China just taken the presidency of the G20, the country have already maintained the International Financial Architecture Working Group. And that working group have been making lots of efforts to improve the effectiveness of the model of the economy. And also very important is that, as you know, that during the press conference, the deputy governor of the PBOC, that is the People's Bank of China, have already highlighted the importance of expanding the, it's very significant of expanding the SDR currency basket and the IMF's, the special drawing rights basket. And the RMB will be included in the SDR basket, the currency basket, on October the 1st. So that will be very significant. That means China will actively engage in the global economy and to play a bigger role in the global economic governance system. Nathan?
Su Yuting, right there where the action will be all weekend in Hangzhou. Thanks so much. And joining us from Shanghai now is Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister of Australia. He also served as that country's foreign minister and is now the president of the Asia Society Policy Institute and also a very good friend of CCTV. Thanks so much for coming back on, Mr. Rudd. You are considered one of the architects, the founders of the G20. It was initially created to tackle a financial crisis like these groupings often are. But this year, obviously looking forward as well. What strikes you about the agenda in Hangzhou?
Well, let me correct you. I'm one of the co-founders. There were many of us back in 2008 of the G20. And we did so in response to the depths of the financial crisis back then. Turning to your question about the agenda for Hangzhou, I think the principal item on the agenda in the minds of heads of government will be how do we go about restoring long-term, sustainable, balanced economic growth to the world. Because the truth is we've had suboptimal growth now for about 7 years, and trade in particular is beginning to lag badly. And so this problem of slow growth, I think, will be foremost in the minds of G20 leaders and how to make a real difference from their meeting here in China.
We have a slogan for the summit which has the 4 I's in it, as we were just talking to Siyu Ting, our reporter, towards an innovative, invigorated, interconnected and inclusive world economy. What does that mean in terms of policies?
Well, on the innovation front, I think the Chinese government has been working for some time to lift its own game in this area. The Chinese, quite rightly, have recognized that this has not been a strength of China's economy in the past, and they've sought to make a quantum leap forward in making the country more driven by scientific innovation and technological development. As a driver of new economic activity, therefore, all eyes will be focused on what Chinese leader Xi Jinping has to say in Hangzhou about new directions for the country on that score. I think the other point to emphasize about China's so-called 4 I's is the last one too, which is inclusive growth. What do we mean by that? I think right across the world we're beginning to see the effect of automation, the introduction of artificial intelligence, whether it's in cars which drive themselves, or whether it's in new technologies on production lines, and also in the services sector, we're beginning to see evidence of industries transforming into jobs-free growth, or growth in industries which has much less labour concentration in the past. This is creating a structural problem for long-term employment. So inclusive growth means how do you bring the rest of the country along with you, rather than leaving them as a group of people who don't benefit from the globalization process. I think, therefore, the inclusive growth component of China's motto for this G20 summit in Hangzhou is an important one.
And inclusion also means countries that aren't normally part of a G7 process as well. The G20, of course, is a wider grouping numerically, but a lot of observers and countries being invited into the process. I'm talking about Chad, Kazakhstan, Laos, Egypt and others. Oh, and remember, we also have to remember that China, even though you're in Shanghai, is essentially a developing economy still. What does that mix provide for the G20 in this setting?
Well, it's perfectly natural for China, given its historical relationship with the G77 and the group of developing countries, which goes back decades now, to define inclusive growth as meaning those countries and those economies as well, not just the developed West and not just the major economic powerhouses of East Asia. And I think that's an important step in the direction of inclusion. When I referred before to inclusiveness, I think it happens at 2 levels. One, within economies where a number of people get left behind by the economic transformation process, particularly driven by automation and new technological innovation. But between countries, you also see this problem of various countries being left behind. Therefore, the concept of inclusiveness deals with groups both within countries and countries themselves, which are not first and foremost in recent economic development history. So I think what China is seeking to do is to plug into those 2 groups at home and abroad and have a strong message and substance for both of them.
So all this need for global growth also has a backdrop, of course, with climate change and being able to having to tackle climate change. Greening the economy is another one of the themes, and also the inclusion of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, which, as you know, went on after the Millennium Development Goals for poverty reduction targets. How is this all going to come together, as well as charting a course for growth?
I think it's very important we stand back from the detail for one moment and ask ourselves, what's contributing to economic growth at the present and what's not, and furthermore, what could contribute further in the future. If you go through the classic toolbox available to economies, I think monetary policy has been tried, but frankly, it's run out of steam because interest rates are now at record lows around the world. Fiscal policy, problem, because most countries have run up significant deficit and debts or sovereign debts. Thirdly, you've seen quantitative easing applied in Japan and the United States and the European Union, but frankly, there's a limit to how far that can go as well. So that brings us on to the question of what actually can drive the global economy in the future. One is the resuscitation of global trade. Here the numbers have been discouraging in recent years. Historically, trade has been at a level of about 2 to 3 times that of the standard global economic growth rate, and now it's either just equal to that rate or even lagging behind. So unplugging the arteries of global trade by getting the Doha round done and advancing other free trade agreements around the world, I think is core business. The other thing I would say is this. New drivers of economic growth also lie in infrastructure, and ensuring that investment flows to infrastructure, such as the Chinese are trying to do with the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, I think is the right step forward. But for the Sustainable Development Goals, for the entire UN community, you need to do that with the delivery of finance, both public and private, to infrastructure development across the world, which makes the Sustainable Development Goals possible. I think that's another key area of growth. And I think if we see a focus on trade, we see a focus on infrastructure investment, as well as the new areas of investment, such as green finance, then I think we're starting to construct new pillars of growth for the future.
How does the G20's agenda fit in with China's national strategy? You brought up infrastructure. Obviously, I'm thinking about the One Belt, One Road initiative and obviously development throughout Asia and beyond. Is that somehow dovetailing into this meeting?
Well, China's own current development strategy was, of course, outlined in the most recent 5-year plan, but anchored also into the decision on new economic direction outlined by the Chinese Communist Party and by the government in 2014. And what that seeks to do is to, of course, develop consumption within the Chinese economy, given the important role which private domestic consumption plays in this country for the future. But I think there's a second element to China's growth strategy still, and that is when you still have 100 million or so people in China living in poverty, making it still an emerging economy, and the government's determination to lift them out of poverty, there's still an infrastructure task to be undertaken. I think the commonality, therefore, lies between China's historical experience of infrastructure investment, which has been so important to the economic story of China for the last 35 years, but also the investment which still must come in order to make a difference for those remaining people. And that dovetails with the infrastructure investment agenda for the rest of the world as well. If there's a second parallel, of course it lies in innovation. China has placed a huge emphasis under Premier Li Keqiang on the country's ability to lift the extent to which global productivity, or should I say national productivity in China, is boosted by innovation. It's one of the core drivers of productivity growth. And that, I think, is the parallel message which the Chinese are seeking to deliver internationally as well, hence the reason why innovation is the first of Xi Jinping's 4 I's for this coming motto for the G20 Summit in Hangzhou.
And we will be keeping our eyes on all the developments in Hangzhou. Kevin Rudd, former Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Australia, thanks so much for joining us from Shanghai. Coming up, we will speak to a panel of economists and analysts about the G20 Summit. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat. Welcome back. As leaders beginning to arrive in Hangzhou, China for the 2016 G20 Summit, we're previewing what the world leaders will be discussing in the coming days. Joining us now for this part of the programme from Beijing, Victor Gao, the Chinese international relations expert and director of the China National Association of International Studies, and also from New Delhi, Varaprasad Dolla, the chair of the Centre for East Asian Studies at the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. With me in the studio, Tamim Bayoumi is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and an international economist on leave from the International Monetary Fund. Thanks so much for joining us, all of you. Victor, I have to start with you in Beijing. Obviously, a sort of sense of excitement in China that it is hosting for the first time G20 Summit. What does China hope to get out of it in terms of its standing in the global economy?
Yes, indeed. This G20 summit meeting in Hangzhou, which will start there in about 2 days' time, is the most important bilateral international event that China is hosting. And for all the other G20 summits before, the hosting country will play a very important role. China is no exception. I'm pretty sure China will do a solid job in terms of organizing all the details. But as far as the substantive issues are concerned, I think China will very much promote a more consensus-based view to further increase the governance side of the equation as far as international trade and economic development and financial matters are concerned. China, after all, is the second largest economy, next only to the United States, but if we use purchasing power parity as the benchmark, China is already the largest economy. Therefore, China's role will be important not only as a participant, but this time as the chairing nation and also as a great contributor to the economic development around the world. And I think the world will be watching what China will do, and I hope China will live up to the expectation, not only in hosting this one, but also leading the way in promoting governance and standard setting for global economic development in the future.
Varun Prasad in New Delhi, obviously innovation part of it, inclusiveness, we're talking about the 4 I's again. There's another one you could put in there if you wanted to, infrastructure. How important of a departure is this G20 summit from others when it tries to tackle the long-term, or at least medium-term, economic challenges of the globe, not necessarily short-term financial crises?
I think a great role that China is going to play in addressing the global downturn is something that is seen across the world as something that many countries do feel that this is going to be a game changer, especially given the manner in which the infrastructure, particularly in the developing countries, has become so pivotal for maintaining the steady economic growth. So it is in this context, if we see that China, given its size of the economy, given its emphasis particularly on one road, one belt, and also on the AIIB, where China has been very keen on improving the infrastructure across Asia and the rest of the world. So therefore, the Chinese contribution to addressing the global downturn is something that is very pivotal in this context.
Tamim, I want to go to you. Obviously, you're on leave from the IMF. The IMF has been taking a lot of criticism in the last 10 years about not being as inclusive as it could, and it has been making reforms. Are we at that sort of pivotal stage where the G20 now are going to have much more influence on writing the rule book of the 21st century when it comes to economic governance? Are we in that post-Bretton Woods situation?
Well, I think that, a lot has already been done. In particular, there has been a change in quotas, which was quite important.
Yeah, explain that just for our audience.
Sorry. The IMF is run by governments,
yeah,
and each government puts in money, and that's what's called a quota, and that defines your voting share. So it's quite important how big your quota is. And for some time now, there's been, given the change in the world economy, there's been more voting power in the advanced countries than there has been in the emerging markets. And there was a big change some time ago which started to move the emerging markets up to where they should be, although it's still a long way from being complete.
What's been the effect of that? What reforms have we seen, and what will the G20 do to push that agenda forward?
Well, what it means is that the organization as a whole, you run by what your shareholders care about.
Absolutely.
And if you have an organization in which more developing countries have more voice, then clearly you focus on the issues that they're interested in, just as China is able to move the world economy, for example, in this G20 summit, towards focusing much more on development than has been true before.
I want to go back to Victor on that point, because inclusiveness is one of the big agenda items here, and we're seeing Chad as head of the African Union being invited, Kazakhstan, Laos, others as well, to participate more fully in the process. What effects do you think that will have in terms of where the G20 agenda goes this weekend?
Well, if we look at the membership of the G20, there is only one African country, South Africa, Africa, as a member, and I think there are altogether more than 55 countries in Africa. Therefore, I think Africa is definitely underrepresented in G20. However, inviting the AU to sit in as an observer for the G20 proceeding will make sure that the spillover effect from the G20 will be shared by all the African countries, and this will enhance the inclusiveness, not only the member states of South Africa as a member of G20, but all the other African countries. And I think inclusiveness is important, not only for the different walks of life in one particular country, but indeed very much so for the G20 members, as well as those countries which are not G20 members. And hopefully in the future, G20 can also be enlarged, and countries like Egypt and Nigeria in Africa in particular could eventually qualify for new membership for G20. And I think China is playing very hard role in promoting this, so that G20 is not a closed door framework, it's more open-ended. More other countries will share the benefits of the consensus view coming out of the G20 summit.
Varaprasad, does India and others appreciate the sort of more focus on sustainable development and, of course, green initiatives as well going forward, given, though, let's remember that growth isn't great at the moment, so there needs to be some sort of balance there, right?
Absolutely. I think if you look at the way in which both India and China have been grappling with the issue of maintaining a steady economic growth alongside ensuring sustainable development, focusing on green economy, and therefore both countries are committed to this very important initiative. As the global economy moves from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, this kind of a paradigm shift that the entire global community is taking quite seriously, and therefore the Indian contribution and the Chinese contribution is quite pivotal to make sure that we have a greener economy and a better world.
Tamim, I just want to perhaps point out a contrast here between what's going to be said at the G20 and what the reality might be in the world. We are seeing our former home country, Brexit, voting to leave the European Union. We're seeing calls for protectionism, trade protectionism here in the United States during the election, and also elsewhere. This sort of globalized sustainable development model, everyone moving together, may be great in Hangzhou over the weekend, but is that where global sentiment is?
Well, I think you're right that sort of the view of global cooperation has had a couple of dents. As you say, Brexit and the US election are very clear examples of that. I think that the more general issue is that the G20 has before called for international cooperation in order to boost growth. The Americans started this in the Pittsburgh Summit in 2009 when they started what was called the mutual assessment process, which was supposed to coordinate everybody's policies to create growth. Now that didn't really go very far. And then the Australians refined that into something much more specific about structural reforms. But again, that didn't go anywhere. And the reason for this is there was a sort of mutual non-aggression treaty across the G20, which is, I won't complain about you if you don't complain about me. So the big question for the Chinese, I think, is how do they break out of that non-aggression treaty?
Well, let's put that to Victor Gao in Beijing. You've hinted that you want the G20 and China too to be more inclusive and to be, let's face it, the main engine of economic decision-making going forward, more inclusive, but it doesn't have a staff. It doesn't have the trappings of the post-World War II institutions. Where would you like to see G20 post Hangzhou, considering it's going to be so central?
Yes, indeed. If we look at the origin of G20, it came out of the ashes of the international financial crisis. And I think there was an immediate requirement for G20 to take impromptu actions to deal with all the fires, for example. However, now that we are in 2016 and China, which has emphasized on the long-term strategic view and handling economic development for the long term, for example, we want to promote a situation where there will be a lot of more strategic emphasis, long-term planning, for example, for the global economic development. In that sense, G20 could turn from a more reactive to piecemeal crisis-based events to a long-term strategic view into the future, beyond the horizon. And I think in this sense, China can really add value to promoting more kind of a standard setting, for example, and more based on rules, for example, and coordination among all the G20 member states, sharing of the information. In the future, I think, to set up a secretariat for the G20 will be a positive step. And also, I think, in the months that G20 Summit is not happening, constant coordination, communication, setting up red lines for the G20 purposes so that leaders within the G20 can call each other at any time when there is a crisis, at any time when there is a flaring up of a genius ideas, for example. That will be very important. G20 should not only just focus on the year-to-year events. G20 should have the luxury of looking into the future, 5 years or 10 years into the future, and then use that kind of long-term vision to come back to guide the global economic developments on an annual basis.
Victor Gao, thanks so much. It's fascinating to watch the global economic architecture change before our very eyes. Victor Gao in Beijing, Varaprasad Dollar in New Delhi, thank you so much. And of course, Tamim Bayoumi here in the studio. Thanks for a great discussion. That's all we have time for, but the conversation does continue online. Catch all of CCTV's America's G20 coverage on the air and online at cctv-america.com/G20, or chat with us on our social media channels. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Weibo. I'm Nathan King in Washington, D.C., and thanks so much for joining us.